All right. Well, hey guys, you are now in Enter the Field strategy. You probably know by now, but I'll just tell you, I'm Matt Peoples, founder director of the Kairos Network, and one of the builders of the training process. I'm here with Pete, who is my co-host in this training exercise, and we're really excited to introduce to you Ben Hoyer. Ben is in Orlando, Florida, and he has planted a church and more is probably the easiest way to put it. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him share a little bit about his story.
Cool. Yeah. So thanks, Matt and Pete. So I have been in Orlando for almost 10 years and started thinking 10 years ago about how to help build the kingdom in Orlando. And over the time, that's taken the form of a congregation we call the Cross Orlando. And it started as a nonprofit called Downtown Credo that was working to cultivate networks of meaning, impact, and community. That's grown into 3 Name Your Price coffee shops and a co-working space. And it's spun out 2 other nonprofits, one called Rally, that's a social enterprise accelerator, and one called Orlando Together, that's working to undermine racial divisions. Almost none of that did we have planned going into it. It's just kind of emerged from some leading questions about how are we people of the kingdom in Orlando?
That's really cool. I love that you asked that question because I think a lot of times we basically enter the field and we say, I'm going to start a church. Did you start out that way, or was your core question from the beginning, how can we be people of the kingdom in Orlando, and the church is just like the first vehicle we're going to use?
So I really I had these, I got called out of seminary to an established church, and then they said, figure out how to start a satellite or a daughter campus. And so I got sent 30 minutes away from my home congregation to start a new church. Sorry, I'm right by a train.
We heard the whistle blow.
Yeah. So I started out going, I need to pull together a group of people who will gather on Sunday and worship and have a worship service. And my first attempts at that, because my personality naturally kind of kicked back against that, did not go very well. And it forced me to really ask the question, do I care about Orlando, or do I just want to get as many people together on Sunday as I can? And I think the second question isn't necessarily bad, but for me it was too small. And I felt like I could develop strategies to get people together on Sunday morning without expanding the presence of the kingdom in Orlando very much. And that if I thought more broadly about who is Orlando and how do I love it as a place, and as people gathered in a city, how do I represent the ethic and culture of the reign of God in Orlando? And then part of that will be a worshiping community on Sunday morning. But broader than that, I'd like to be a presence for the kingdom in Orlando. That was when I really started thinking creatively about how to be a person for God in my city.
I think that's huge that you bring that up, because a real core point I think people need to pull from this is entering the field doesn't begin by entering the field. It begins by asking the right questions as you enter the field, because the right answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer. And I love how your thinking changed, and it looks like a core part of that thinking changed because your questions changed, and because your questions changed, your focus changed.
I just started to get honest with myself. Wow, I actually didn't really care about the problems or the people in my city. I was just caring about them just enough to do something in order to get them to come to my thing.
Wow.
When I was honest, my heart was not moved or upset by the poverty in my city. If I was honest, I wasn't really moved or concerned by the injustice of racial inequity in my city. I was not really. I was a little bit concerned about the lostness of people. people that were not connected to the gospel and the ways that the gospel would help them, but I was not willing to meet them where they were. And when I looked at meaning, give them the portion of the gospel or the kingdom that actually helped their situation. And when I looked at the way that Jesus engaged sick people, um, demonically tormented people, right? Or even like the woman at the well, like people that are marginalized or socially disenfranchised, and the way that he gave them aspects of his reign that actually solved their tangible problems, I realized I did not care about them enough to do that. I would
Hmm.
only give them the piece that brought them to my thing on Sunday morning. And so I had to take a step back from getting them to my thing on Sunday morning to think more deeply about how do I meet them with the aspects of the reign of God that will address their immediate problem and situation.
So you kind of had two times you technically entered the field. You had the time where you literally moved to where you were going, planting a church, and then you had the not to do a bad pun, you had to come to Jesus.
Yeah.
And even though you were living in that context, you really literally rethought what it looked like to enter that field again.
Yeah, I think so.
So
Yeah.
take me back to, did that look like the church closing down and reopening, or did it look like a radical shift in priorities? Like, what did it look like when you started entering the field well? And then what were some of those good questions you were asking that then led to, because you talked earlier, like it started as a church, but when you realized you were a kingdom expression, now there's a coffee house, now there's an organization that's fighting sex trafficking, I think you said there's something that's working on racial injustice, um, which I think all stemmed from those questions you were asking. So what happened when you re-entered the field?
Yeah. So I took the website I had created for the church and redirected it to a nonprofit that I was starting. I started to ask honestly about what I cared about, and and then what people would hear in town. And I started a couple of things at the same time. One, to get myself into places. One of my first moves in that was like, um, I started to say, where would I find Jesus in my town if he were here? And it wasn't in the neighborhood that I was living in, and it wasn't on the streets I was driving down. And I actually didn't care about the poor, socially marginalized, and disenfranchised. And I decided at that point it wasn't because I was a jerk. Like, I'm not a heartless jerk, though I might have been acting like it,
Yeah.
right? The problem was that I just wasn't exposed to that. And so I made a decision that if I expose myself to this poverty and injustice over a period of time, because my heart is soft, I will care about those things. But I have to make an intentional choice to expose myself to it. Because if I just go through my life, I'll end up associating with people like me. And people like me live in well-heeled areas, drive down well-paved streets, and have a positive relationship with police and power and money.
Mm.
And people that don't look like me, I have to go and seek that out. And so I started doing that. And while I was doing that, I also looked at what are challenges that undermine people at all levels of affluence. How can I serve the city? Like, really, it was like looking at Jesus arrives in a town and they bring all their sick to him, and he heals them and he sends them away and doesn't ask anything else of them. And I was trying to figure out what his motivation is there, and the easiest answer I could find is that he doesn't want them to be sick anymore.
Hmm.
And so I started to think about, I'm not a healer. Like, I don't have the spiritual gift of healing. I've seen healings, but it's not my number one. And so if all of Orlando started bringing their problems to me, what would be the thing that I could help them with? And I started to think about the way that our culture is driven around kind of materialism, the idea that life is better if I get more things. And so I started trying to create a space that challenged people to think about building their life around meaning, impact, and community instead of comfort, entertainment, and isolation.
Hmm.
And
There's so
so,
much, just unpack that for a minute. I mean, there's so much in what you just said.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you dropped the line before, the ethic and the culture of the reign of God. I'm like, whoa, there's so much meaning packed in what you're saying. Can you
Yeah.
just pause right there and talk about those three pairs of words that you just put out?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, like what I started to realize is that the reign of God is real, meaning he has created uh, an alternate set of authority and community that has its own culture and ethic.
Mm.
And so rather than just marketing my Sunday morning experience and trying to recruit people to come to that, I could also embody that culture and ethic out in the city.
Wow.
So then I had to try and figure out, how do I put, what is the culture and ethic of the reign of God that I will represent and live out in my city among the poor and among the wealthy. And that's where I came to this like meaning, impact, and community. And that's not like exhaustive. Those are just words that occurred to me that I could backfill with deeper meaning for folks,
Okay.
and kind of plant a flag for meaning, impact, and community that would carry the culture and ethic. And so that's what got me in. That driving force is saying, I want to rally people around meaning, impact, and community, is what got me into coffee. And it's actually it's a social enterprise accelerator that I mentioned earlier. So it's helping people start new social enterprises with money and mentorship. And we could go into that if we want, but the short version of it is it gathers entrepreneurs and funders and successful business people around the ideas of meaning, impact, and community.
Wow. So talk about coffee for a minute, because coffee is such a big part of the story.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
and actually, wait a second. Before we do that, like, it's like a fire hose, which is awesome. But I just want to like tie something together here for people. Is, here in the story that Ben said, in order to develop a heart for the people he was trying to reach, he had to live around those people. Entering the field is a big part of you putting yourself in the mission field you're trying to reach, because it's hard to reach people that you don't have a connection with. And as you were in there longer, as you made that move, what you're saying is that your heart grew more and more for the people that you were around, and your understanding of their issues grew.
Yeah, and I had to go to. For me, it was like I was not going to live in the poor sections of town, because to be honest, I don't care enough. Like I'm not willing to subject myself to the injustice and the uncomfort, the discomfort of living in the poor areas. But I do think that the reign of God is most comfortable in the areas of the poor and fighting for the issues of the poor. And so rather than like write it off and say, because I'm not willing to go through the discomfort of living with the poor, I have nothing to offer there, I find ways to authentically be present there. And that started with, literally in my town, like you can drive, there are parallel streets to get like north and south through town, and you can drive on one that's the nice pretty business district, or you can drive on another one that's in the poor, on the other side of the tracks, right? And so I just decided to start taking this road. It's my first step. It was like, I'm just going to drive different roads and see different homes, see different businesses, and have to drive across the divide from the wealthy to the poor every day to get across town. Then I'll start looking at who could I. And so I walked into the Boys and Girls Club and said, I'm not good with kids, so don't ask me to spend an hour a week with kids, but I am good at planning things, and I'd love to plan something for you, And I started just like finding people that I could make friends with, and using projects as an excuse to make friendships with people that were different from me, and saw that my heart began to care as I realized what it means to grow up poor, Black, and in the city, and how different that is to grow up white, middle class, and from the suburbs.
So a big part of entering the field for you was also, changing your rhythms and then creating intentional partnerships to be able to be more invested in the community.
Yeah.
Now, that's cool. Now, talk about coffee.
Oh, cool. So, So I started to get kind of enamored with this idea of the culture of God and the culture of the reign of his kingdom. And also felt like a lot of times when we started trying to build that, we got kind of stuck in cul-de-sacs of like the culture of God is opposite of pornography and certain sexual ethics stuff. But I was like, that feels really small. And like we ought, the culture of God is deeper and ought to have more far-reaching consequences than merely my own personal piety.
Yeah.
And it includes my own personal piety. But if I stay there, I have a small version of the reign of God, and the reign of God is disruptive, right? So I started to consider like structural stuff, and I like the first thing I started to think about was a lot of my friends were motivated about peace in Congo and the longest running civil war in the world, and I realized that like part of how that war is funded is the metal that's mined out of the Congo that goes into my phones. And I realized that the phone I'm buying is supporting the civil war in the Congo. But to be honest, like I'm not going to stop buying an iPhone. Like I can't,
Yeah.
you know, but like, okay, I repent, right? And sin boldly, right? But like, I had a friend of a friend who was already going down to Guatemala to through his Rotary and mission group and partnering with group. He was bringing clean water filters and computers for their schools there, but realized that he had a roaster in his bagel shop in Gainesville. And better than bringing clean water filters, he could just buy coffee from them directly, pay them way more than they could get through a different system, and that would help. And I began to realize that coffee is just one like structure where we are subjugating the poor in the world for our afternoon latte. And I thought, I can't fix phones and clothes and cars and tomatoes. I can't fix everything, but just because I can't fix everything doesn't mean I shouldn't plant a flag for something, right? And so like coffee, I had friends of friends who were doing it, and I could figure out a way. And it fit around this notion of meaning, impact, and community, so I could take it to the city under the ethic of the reign of God.
So
So
it's the credo. I mean, because coffee's the link to everything you were talking about. To say, here's where I live, here's where most of the people that I know live, and
yeah,
here's where the reign of God is bigger than that.
yeah,
Coffee in this credo was really the brilliant, I think, the link
yeah,
between those two worlds. It was the start of the flow.
yeah. People started to get it once I had coffee connected to it. I got to plug in my computer.
That's really cool, because literally you're just that simple. And I think people should understand this. Entering the field isn't always a massive thing, but you've described for us a couple simple changes that anybody could make that aren't groundbreaking, but radically changed every other step after. You changed the questions first, then you changed the route you were driving so that you could get to know the community in a different way, and then you changed some of the places you were going and the focus you had, so the partnerships you were making. And now all of a sudden, 100 steps down the road, you're fighting injustice through a chain of, I guess it's a chain now, what, you got like 3 or something?
Yeah, we have
Yeah. So we'll call that a chain. Uh, a chain of very intentional, kingdom-minded coffee houses. And so I think, some people may think like, when we walk through like some of the church planting stuff, like we always want to short circuit the process. We always want to be, we want to see what Ben's doing, and we want to be at 3 coffee houses and figure out just how to get there. But you shortchange that process, and you lose what gives you the ability to create those coffee houses to begin with. And
yeah.
and we can't be afraid of the small changes, the incremental changes, the small things we're doing in this planting process as we enter the field, because you didn't know back then what God was going to do with it.
No, that's right. Yeah. And I didn't know, I mean, 6 months before we started a coffee shop, I didn't know we'd be starting a coffee shop,
Hmm.
I built that the coffee thing because I wanted to show people that, and myself, that this way of thinking has global implications, and we have the potential to be people of global impact with small choices that we're making. And that if you go deeper, that is the ethic of the reign of God. Like, weakness is strength, right? And so people all the time are like, man, how does it work that people get to decide what to pay for coffee in your coffee shops? All of our coffee shops are name your price, you know? And the first
Oh,
thing I
wow.
tell them is, I've never run a coffee shop any other way, so I don't have anything to compare it to, you know? And then the next thing I tell them is, I'm not trying to get rich, so it works well enough, right? But then the third thing I tell them is, it completely changes your experience of morning coffee when you come up to get it and you ask what they pay and the barista say, what would you like to pay? It completely changes what's happening in that exchange between the barista and the person coming to get your cup of coffee. And not all of our baristas are people of faith. And most folks that come in don't connect faith to credo, but they do connect that there are people in the world who are interested in something else besides making money, and they're interested in a conversation. It opens their mind to who they might be. They might not just be a consumer. They can be somebody who can join a movement to do something else. It changes the conversation, disrupts their normal patterns, and begins them thinking differently. And for me, that's like the best opening, right?
Then I think that's huge because, you know, as you enter the field, I'm really struck by something that was said, and I'm blanking on his name. You guys can help me. He's a Australian missional community guy that did a lot of stuff with Alan Hirsch. And he's done a bunch.
Mike
Frost.
Frost. Yeah.
Mike Frost said something that's just rocked my world recently. He says, not everybody's an evangelist, you know? But he says, as Christians, we're not called to all be evangelists. We're just called to live in a weird way. And when we live in that weird way, it should leave the world looking and going, what is different? And he says, too often we just look like everybody else. And the way you described creating that coffee house and entering that field is just amazing to me, because right from the moment somebody walks into that coffee house for the first time, or maybe they're walking in again, or maybe they had to go purchase coffee somewhere else and you're the regular coffee house, and they're going, why in the world would these guys ever say, name your price? You know, that's just weird. And getting to see a business owner that's not concerned with making enough money to live on the better end of town, but really wants a coffee house that fits in the community. Because not only that, as you were telling your story, you've just described a coffee house that really bridges the gap between the wealthy and the poor, because the person that can't afford it is able to come in and get a good morning cup of coffee and pay what they can afford. And the person that can afford it and wants to do greater good in the community will probably pay more than they would have at a Starbucks or another chain, because they're doing something that's got a greater good. And so all of a sudden you're bringing those people together too. It's a powerful thing.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been a fun project for sure.
So Ben, you made the connection between the barista and the customer on any given day, you know, how it changes the conversation.
Yeah.
So for most people viewing this, you know, they think about planting a church, entering the field that way. Go back to how the conversation was changed initially. You know, there's the classic thing about wanting people to come to my thing as a church planter, as opposed to what's God's thing and how do we take part in that. You found as a church planter, I know just from talking to you, that when you first started explaining to people you were a church planter, people, you know, kind of the end of the conversation, but the idea behind this credo, not the coffee shop yet, but this creed was really the way to change the conversation. I think that's just really important. Would you talk about that?
Yeah. It's funny. That was a formative memory for me. So moving back to Orlando is in the ballpark of where I grew up. So I grew up about 20 minutes north of here. And so I still had friends from high school that were around. And so I had been gone for about 9 or 10 years, and I was moving back and I was getting ready to start this place. And so I started immediately reconnecting with the friends of mine that were in town. And I had one friend in particular who was on my email lists, positive, like saying, oh yeah, we should come check it out. But I could never get her to come to anything. And I finally reached out to her and I asked her, hey, what's going on? And she said, you know, I consider myself a Christian, But the stuff that you're talking about, like putting my faith in practice and joining a group of people that want to do that, she's like, that just sounds really too intense for me. And I'm like, I'm scared about that. And so I'm probably not going to come to anything. I was like, and this was a person that I was like close friends with, and was like reconnected with me. And then like a week or so later, she invited me to this thing for a nonprofit organization called Falling Whistles, which was working for peace in the Congo, like I mentioned. And the guy that started it was coming to town, and he, it's a heartbreaking story, but the short version is they had whistles that they would sell, and the whistles would fund a lot of their work. And so he had come into town and was trying to set up what he called a whistleblower group. And he was telling these people that we ought to care about peace in the Congo, that we're complicit in supporting its systems by the way that we buy phones and buy that metal. He said, but I don't just want your money. He said, I want you to work together I want you to form a group of people in town and really become a whistleblower with your life. Become an advocate for these people over there. Let's all agree together to make this part of our core identity, that we'll all be whistleblowers. And I realized this guy was like, he had elements of the reign of God, that these people, these young folks, wanted something larger to be a part of, an issue that they could care about, that they could leverage their life on, that would demand something of them. This was a kingdom call that they were responding to when they were rejecting the church. And I started to think that there was an opportunity to talk about the reign of God in a way that spoke to the people where they were. And that's this like ethic, this idea of meaning, impact, and community for me. But like, let's talk about the ethic of the reign of God. And as we build relationships around this ethic, allow the Holy Spirit to do the work that he does. So that's when I stopped the church and just started this nonprofit. I'm just like, I'm just going to do that.
So you still had the church at that point. You were inviting her to the church stuff you were doing. And then that was like a critical linchpin moment for you to say, we got to change what we're doing.
Yeah, it was like I was inviting her to core group stuff, like Bible studies, and then some service project stuff. And the service project stuff just didn't work. I got a few people, and so then that's when I stopped. I took the URL that I had the church under, and I just took the same name and made a nonprofit, and just changed all the content on the website. Formed a separate 501c3 from the church, pulled together a board, and did that for 6 months. And then after the nonprofit got started, I restarted the church under a different name with a core group of people and a little bit different philosophy, so that the church happened naturally through relationships and wasn't the marketed or branded entity in the front. And it's kind of stayed that way.
So when I listen to that, it strikes me that takes courage. Right? I mean, it goes against everything that your donors, your
for
church
sure.
network was expecting, your training. Did it feel to you in that moment that was a huge move or a courageous move? Or you were just like oh, this is the Holy Spirit whispering to me, I'm going to follow?
No, it felt significant. But I also at that point was like in inner turmoil enough to know like I could follow a traditional church planting path and maybe find success, but I would not be myself, and I would be less than happy. And so by that point I had decided I'm going to try this. I've got 2 more years of funding, and if it fails, I'd rather go down with a ship I believe in than one that I don't. And if it goes down, then I'll go preach somewhere else. That was like really what I thought. And at several points, it was like even close friends of mine were like, "This is never going to work. Like, you have your head in the clouds. You can't start a church that doesn't have a branded identity, that doesn't have a marketing strategy or a plan, that just happens through word of mouth that you don't talk about. Like, that won't work." And I remember telling him, I may have my head in the clouds, but I need it in the clouds right now because I've got another 1.5 years of this, and I've got to not be depressed.
Yeah.
Like I got to believe it can work, and I'd rather go down with it than build something I don't believe in.
And I think that's really important. I think Pete, you hit it. Ben, you hit it. Entering the field does feel like a risk, and it should feel like a risk because you are risking something. But I think I love how you said it, Ben, because I resonate with the way you said it because I felt the exact same way before we came out here to launch the Kairos Network. And it was just basically like, you know, I know I can make this long a go of it, but I would rather see what happens. I would rather try and fail than to never have tried at all. And I think in entering the field, you can't be afraid to fail. Sometimes people will be so afraid to fail that they're never able to get off the ground. I think the real, a much healthier fear is just not doing it, you know?
Yeah.
Because
For
even
sure.
in your failures, kingdom work happens.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes up in my preaching a lot is like people of faith have all the hard questions answered, right? So I know my eternity is secure. My provision is solid. Like my identity is solid. I am loved not for my actions, but for who I am. So like all the hard questions for me are answered. Christians ought to be the ones who are the most free to risk.
Yeah.
Because there's so much less we're risking. We're not risking identity. We're not risking future. We're not risking security. And so we are, but to put that in play means if this fails, God will have something else for me, right? And I'll go do that then. But for today, he has this for me. And that was really like, it did feel like a risk because I didn't really know, I didn't have a whole course charted out. It was like, I think I'll like my life if I become this sort of person who actually cares about the city, who and follows his heart to serve the city in a way that they'll receive. I think I'll like my life better, but I don't know. Like it might suck.
Oh man. I mean, that's some amazing stuff on entering the field. And, you know, we'll definitely be coming back, having more conversations, in this training process stuff. Cause you've got a lot to share. Ben, thanks for taking the time to share with us. We're going to have linked in the notes, of this training module, links to be able to connect up, with you, and kind of the stuff that you're doing. But what's the best place for people to find you and what you're doing?
I think just email me, right? Is that what you mean? Or like,
Yeah. Or like, do you have a website where they can learn more about Credo and stuff?
I mean, Credo has a website. It's downtowncredo.com. Our church has a website. It's thecrossorlando.org. And then, you can email me or find me on socials or whatever.
Cool. Ben, thanks a bunch, man. I really appreciate you just pouring into guys that are training to plant.
Absolutely, man. I'm excited for it.
Yeah. Awesome stuff.